Come over here. I'm going to talk today a little bit about green landscaping, a little bit about heat, and I'm hoping to sort of accomplish a couple goals. One is I want to start with some policy motivation for how economics might feed into policy. Right? So I want to sort of start with this big picture, especially I'm going to think about Phoenix, Arizona for the talk today, but this is applicable in other places as well. We could think about incidents of severe storms and things like that that come from increasing urban areas across many cities, even on the East Coast and the Midwest, places like that. But I want to think about the policy role and then how economics plays into that. And then I want to show how the economics sometimes gets a little tough. Right? And I'm going to show some creative new techniques we've come up with that previously in economics have been sort of hard to answer some of these questions, and I'm hopefully going to convince you that we've got a good way to actually get at some of these competing trade-offs across the landscape. So I want to start with thinking broadly about how households care about microclimate. And so one of the things people do all over the country is we alter the landscape. So it's really obvious in a place like Phoenix, it's really obvious in these arid Las Vegas areas. You fly in, and you see communities in the middle of the desert and everything is green, right? Or you go around places and you see lakes in the middle of the desert that people's houses are around, and they actually use these lakes for water skiing, right? They moved from Minneapolis, Minnesota somewhere, they have snowbirds, but they don't want to give up their lakes, right? So we start altering landscapes, we do lots of things to try to do that. The other thing that and there's an example of a lake, this is actually in Phoenix, Arizona. So we create these nice amenities because people like them. Another thing we might do is we might change housing structures. So it could be that in Boston or in New York or even in Columbus, we have lots of 2-story, 3-story type apartment buildings, 2- and 3-story houses. And maybe there's some benefit to that where it's really cold in the winter because the heat rises. So if you've ever been in an apartment and it was winter and you're on the second floor, you probably didn't have to turn your heat on very much if the guy below you kept his heat up pretty high, right? When you get to arid environments, right, we might have fewer multi-story houses. Right? And so one result of that is that our houses, if we want the same size houses, are going to take up a lot more space. Right? And so we start to have maybe a trade-off with sprawl. Right? So we start to think about these trade-offs. Other things we do, there's been suggestions we should all paint our roofs. I know a couple of researchers out of Princeton, Elie Bouzid and Jim Smith, have talked about Baltimore as an example. And they said if everyone in Baltimore would just paint their roof white, or green, but white would be better, we could cool Baltimore down by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. Okay? It's just because of the heat retention, right? So there's pitches to do things like this. In Phoenix, Arizona, in the 1950s, there were 300,000 people. In 2010, there were 4 million people. And over that time period, nighttime temperatures have gone up by 6 degrees Celsius. Okay? And so people are starting to say, well, boy, this is, we're now pushing 80 degrees as an average nighttime low temperature in the middle of summer, right? And that has lots of other costs. So there's lots of things people could do. Another thing people can do is they could think about green landscaping, right? Get some evaporational cooling. They could start installing these different amenities, and that then creates other trade-offs, especially in an arid environment, when we start using a scarce resource like water in order to mitigate something that we've done, such as create higher temperatures, right, through our concrete and asphalt type surfaces. So I want to ask the sort of big picture question is if households are responding to microclimate, right? We're making all these different changes, right? Is it possible from an economic standpoint to actually identify how much people are willing to pay to avoid some of these undesirable things, right? So we see people doing this. We see people pay different amounts for different housing depending on where it's located. Can we actually figure out how much people are willing to pay to avoid some of this undesirable climate outcomes? And that then feeds into policy discussions. So if we know how much somebody's willing to pay and we have some different policy ideas, right, we can then start to put a dollar value at least on how much, say, this policy would reduce temperatures by a couple degrees. Well, what is that worth to people? And then what is the cost of the policy? So we're starting to work our way towards something like a benefit cost idea. So as I said, this paper that I'm going to talk about today is based in Phoenix, but it's broadly applicable to the whole Southwest US, especially when I start talking about heat island effects. And it's, this over climate change effects, we see maybe Ohio gets a little wetter, we might actually get maybe a little bit warmer, which might be good here, especially given this past winter. In the southwestern US, it's going to get drier, it's going to get hotter, which is going to exacerbate some of the resource problems they have. Also, the southwest US, due to the slightly aging population in the US, is a real destination for retirees. So we've seen a lot of growth in sort of housing and urban sprawl and development. A lot of companies have moved there because it's easy to manufacture year-round. You don't have snow concerns, it's comfortable for workers. But this urban sprawl, this sort of increased development leads to increased heat, which might exacerbate some of these problems with climate change. This has led to, at least in Phoenix, this has led to a bunch of policy concerns, and maybe some limited responses are starting to happen. So one of the discussions is, should impervious surface be limited? And when they mean limit impervious surface, they're not thinking so much from a water perspective. It doesn't rain a whole lot in Phoenix. They're just thinking that if you get gravel instead of asphalt, you retain less heat. Right? The gravel actually in between the pieces of gravel is shaded during the day, right, from the other gravel, right, and doesn't pick up as much heat. Right? But if we start to do this, if we start to put buildings farther apart, right, there's cost to this. Maybe one of the costs might be increased sprawl. Another idea that's been talked about in Phoenix is maybe we should encourage green landscaping for moisture and evaporation cooling. Right? So Phoenix has rights to the Colorado River. They have senior rights to the Colorado River in many of the municipalities. So they have enough water at the peak growth period. They could support the peak boom growth for 100 years. Right? So they have tons of water. It's not their water, right? It's coming from Colorado through an aqueduct system, but they have rights to that water. And so, you don't win re-election by saying this, but the planners, the water department there, they're not worried about water. I mean, you see lots of fountains in Phoenix, even on public buildings, right? Because they have rights to the Colorado. Now, maybe from a more global sustainability picture, we might think that might not be such a good idea, but to the local people, right, to the local planners, they're not worried about water, so maybe this would make Phoenix a nicer place because we put a bunch of green landscaping, it cools the temperatures a couple degrees, right, and maybe it creates an amenity. People can take their kids out in the backyard, take their dogs out, play ball, things like that. Right? But at the cost of water. Another thing, Sharon Harlan and a couple of co-authors at Arizona State are starting to think about economic justice questions. And so when you look around Phoenix, the minority population largely lives in some of the hottest areas. And by hottest areas, we mean 2-3 degrees Celsius, so 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than other places. That raises electric bills, so we're looking at minorities, typically low incomes, who can't afford to spend the extra money on electricity, right? So there's an economic justice question. Also incidents of heat stress, of heat stroke. A lot of these lower income areas are day laborers, they're working in that type of environment, and this added temperature, right, is negatively affecting their health, right? So there's lots of reasons, lots of policy reasons people are starting to think about the impacts of urban sprawl, the impact of that on heat, and then what can be done about it, right? Other stories, ozone, the incidence of ozone and the problems with ozone increase with heat, so it gets hotter, you get more ozone air quality type issues, right? So it touches on lots of different things. So my main objective is to start to narrow this back down, right? And so those were sort of broad ideas of what we could think about, broad ideas of what we could do. And I want to narrow this to think about the trade-offs households are prepared to make, right? And trade-offs thinking about in dollars. Trade-offs households are prepared to make to avoid heat and obtain complementary goods or services. So a complementary good or service could be something like a landscape choice, or it could be, in some of my other work that I'm not going to talk about today, it could be the provision of urban lakes, right? Things that, how much are households willing to pay to avoid heat and get these other things, right? And these things are very much linked through a physical process, so I've got to treat them together. I've got to think about these things together. So the sort of overview of where this is going is I want to talk about some of the challenges of doing this from an economics perspective, right? So seems okay, yeah, how much do people care about heat? Well, maybe we could ask them, right? That's one approach. People have asked them, people say they care about heat, right? I'm going to try to actually use market transactions people make and think about housing to try to back out what people are revealing to me through their decisions that they make in the market. Okay. This is easier said than done, especially when we think about something like heat that varies over very large spatial scales. It doesn't vary from house to house like square footage does, right? Whereas some of the other things I've talked about that are complementary, such as green landscaping, your yard's green, your neighbor yard's not, right? Varies very locally. So how do I treat both of these at the same time and get the right value for these, right? That's going to be the economic challenge. I'm going to give a little bit more insight into urban heat island. I'll show a pretty picture that came from some PRISM data, which is a university, or comes out of Oregon State. They have taken remote sensing data, they've sort of ground truth that, and they've backed out what temperatures should be across the whole country, and so you can get very specific data. I'll talk a little about that. And then really focus in briefly on some of the econometrics, right? So I want to show some of the flavor of what some of the research would look like if you were an economist and you're going to go out and try to tackle this problem and then tie this back to policy. And feel free to interrupt at any point with questions.
So do we know how aware potential buyers are of the variation in heat across the...
Yes, so two ways I'm going to answer that. So, well, maybe 3 ways. So there have been surveys done in Phoenix, and people say they're very aware. Anecdotally, so everybody has an anecdotal story, I was getting my hair cut when I was a postdoc at Arizona State, I was getting my hair cut at a place and somebody asked me where I lived and she goes, oh, that's the hot part of town, right? So anecdotally somebody knows, but what I really want to do is, regardless if they know this, right, if there's some maybe broad understanding on average of where it's hot, where it's not, can I actually pick this up statistically from an economic model? Right? And so can I test this to see whether or not, A, if they know this, but B, if I can get it. Now, if I can't convince you the economics is right, the model is right, then we could continue this debate. Anecdotally, yes, I think people are aware. Yeah, she told me you live in a hot part of town. I asked where she lived, and she told me like the specific, I was new to the area, I didn't know where this was. But she lived up in the foothills, and apparently it really is like 8 degrees colder there. So she was right, but I didn't know that at the time. So to think about how to develop a model to sort of tease this out, right? So we're thinking about housing. I'm going to think about the different temperatures you get, the different landscapes you get, as well as all the other housing attributes you get when you buy a house. And then if I can parse that price of that house out into these individual pieces, I can tell you potentially how much somebody's willing to pay for that component of housing price. So this picture up here presents sort of the classical derivation of a hedonic model. And the hedonic model is the idea that there's this basket of goods, there's this basket of attributes that come from choosing a house. Everything from school quality to the temperature of your neighborhood to how many bathrooms your house has. And if I can then figure out a way to see a price of that, which I do when people buy houses, right? If I can parse that price into all these individual attributes, I can start to tell you how much people are willing to pay for these. So this picture up here is sort of the orangey yellow color. These are offer curves. So we could think of these being, if you owned a house, if you were a developer, how much would you be willing to sell your house for? Think about the eBay example. Hedonic's more generic than just housing. In eBay, if you wanted to go and list an auction, you might set a reserve price. You're offering something for sale. In this case, a house. In eBay, maybe it's a new ballpoint pen. You're offering something for sale. There's lots of people offering houses with different types of attributes. There's lots of different types of ballpoint pens, right? We offer them at different prices depending on their attributes. At the same time, there might be a group of people that are looking to buy homes. In Phoenix, it's a very large group, and they're making bids for housing. So they look at all the attributes of a house, its square footage, bedrooms, bathrooms, how hot it is in that community, right? They look at lots of different things and they make bids for a house. When a seller can get the highest value and a bidder can get the lowest possible bid they have to pay to get that particular attribute, we get a housing transaction. With large numbers of people all working in the market, this traces that we start to see lots of transactions. So in this example here, Z might be square footage or temperature, some attribute of a house. People are making lots of bids depending on those attributes. They vary. Square footage varies across homes. People are selling homes with lots of attributes. So I'd have a whole bunch of pictures that look like this for every attribute of a house. And when I see a transaction, that's where a bid and an offer matched. That's where eBay says, ding, you've won, right? You bid and offer come together. So these transactions are going to trace out this thing that I'm going to call P of Z, which is the price for that particular attribute. So in the real world, right, this would be very multidimensional. There might be 100 of these attributes, and it'd be hard to draw that picture, right? But for each attribute, there's going to be some price vector associated with varying levels of that, controlling for everything else, right? And that's the idea of a hedonic. So the hedonic model is going to try to estimate what the function, what this P of Z thing looks like. Okay. If Z goes up, square footage goes up, does housing price go up, holding everything else constant? At some point, does housing price start to flatten out? Maybe that's the case when you get high levels of Z in this picture. As you get larger and larger square footage, the amount you're willing to pay for that additional amount of square footage might be getting a little lower, right, than the first square foot of your house. Okay. So that's a hedonic model. Okay. Comes from some economic theory about utility and people being maximizers subject to budget constraints. So in more words, right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a big data set of housing transactions, a big data set of property characteristics. So I'm going to know a whole bunch of stuff about your house, right, about your surrounding environmental conditions as well, green landscaping, whether or not your neighbors have green landscaping, how old your house is, is there a good quality school? I'm going to know a whole bunch of stuff about your neighborhood, right? And I'm going to think about home buyers or renters here that are viewing houses as bundles of desired characteristics, and they pick a home to maximize their welfare given the constraints they face. In a place like Phoenix, I don't have to worry about this being too patchy. Out of 4 million people living there, out of 1 million plus single-family residential homes, there's a pretty continuous provision of all these amenities in different types of bundles. if I was looking in exurbia, maybe in Delaware County, or maybe up in Marion in Ohio, and I had a very thin market, I might have to worry about how patchy this is. In a place like Phoenix, with lots of continuous attributes, I don't have to worry too much about that. The theory shows that if markets are reasonably competitive, right, and we're in equilibrium, which means there's lots of these buyers and sellers making bids and offers, right, there's nobody that has monopoly power. There's not just one seller of houses, okay? Then I can back out what the willingness to pay of homeowners are going to be for a small change in one of these underlying attributes, square footage, temperature, things like that. Okay. So that's my economic model. So seems okay, right? When you go to buy a car, right, we do this, we look at all the attributes of the car. Does it have airbags? What color is it? How many miles per gallon? And you go to the car dealership and he's offering the car a price and you tell the guy a price, right, and you buy a car, right, when you agree, right? Same thing in housing, right? So it seems fairly straightforward, except there's going to be a whole variety of challenges, and some of these are going to be unique to this heat island microclimate problem, and some of these are more generic in nature and accrue to lots of problems, especially ones that vary spatially. So landscape amenities, this is a very generic problem with hedonics. These are probably going to have multiple benefits, and these benefits are going to happen at different spatial scales. So I really like having a green yard, right? I like to be able to go outside, take my dog out, play in the yard, but I might also be providing benefits to my neighbor if my trees provide some kind of noise buffering from my yard to his yard. Right? So I'm buying a house with a tree between me and the neighbor, it's on my yard, but my neighbor's getting benefit from that tree. Or maybe in Phoenix, if I really like green landscaping, maybe if I were moving to Phoenix from Ohio, I wouldn't want to live in somewhere where there was no green, right? I might like to come to a neighborhood where everybody sort of had green lawns, right? It might remind me of home, right? So I might get benefit from living in that neighborhood because other people in that neighborhood have done something, right? That's a more coarse spatial scale than my own specific home, but my home value is going to capture that, right? Because I'm going to pay more for that house in that green neighborhood than I would otherwise, okay? So we're going to have some of this stuff that's maybe very complex in how it works across spatial scales. Okay? Another problem, or another challenge, is that these landscape amenities are inputs into other valued amenities. So temperature, landscape is an input into temperature. Okay? So if everybody has green landscaping, right, that's going to lower the temperatures through evaporational cooling, right? So I can't sort of disconnect these pieces. If I ignored landscape and only looked at temperature differences across space, right, my temperature differences would capture not only the value of temperature, but it might also capture the value of landscape, right? Because cooler areas would have more green landscape. So if I liked green landscaping, I'm willing to pay for green landscaping in Phoenix, and I like lower temperatures, right, I've sort of confounded the two. I've mixed those two up, and I'm going to recover a value for temperatures that reflects both the green landscaping and the temperatures. So I have to treat these things in the same model in order to try to tease out these effects. Okay. Another problem is omitted variables. Okay. So if I was in a room in this building and I had a bunch of people sitting around and I gave them postcards of houses and I said, how much would you pay for this house? Here's all the attributes, right? I know everything about that house because I just gave it to them on a postcard. When I go into the real world and I look at people buying and selling homes, there's probably lots of things that led them to buy and pick those homes that I see that they see and I don't, right? So I see lots of stuff, but they see even more, right? They know that 5 years ago there was a murder down the street, right? Or they know that that local school is about to be closed, and I don't know that, right? Or they know that every home in this neighborhood was built by some inferior construction builder, right? The realtor tells them this and they're not willing to pay as much, right? Things I don't know that they see, right? So I've got to worry about how to control for omitted variables, right? That's going to confound my estimates if I can't adequately control for these things. The common technique in the literature, if you've seen any of the quasi-experiment or random assignment of people, right? So we might think about in that my lab experiment, I randomly give people different attributes, right? So I break any kind of correlation, right? The common technique in the applied literature when I go out and I take real-world data is to essentially use fixed effects to try to soak everything up, right? So I put an effect in for living in the neighborhood, soaks everything in that neighborhood up. That's going to cause me big problems because of my spatial scale story. It's going to soak up too much. So here's, this PowerPoint is fantastic. It makes my dull slides move a little bit. I'm not sure why, but it didn't do this on my computer, but it's fancy. So let's think about the omitted variable problem. This is going to be the economic innovation to what I'm presenting today, is thinking about how to solve this spatial scale problem. right, and omitted variables. So if I was looking at a set of 5 houses, right, and maybe I have a couple houses up high, right, looking out over the valley, and I've got a couple houses down here in another neighborhood that are sort of at the bottom of this big hill, and I was trying to think about what explains the price differences. Houses are identical, right, except for some are really up high and some are down low, and there's a cell phone tower. Okay. So if I just ran a model and I tried to decompose these housing prices, but let's pretend, right, right, so I'm going to control for everything that's common about homes in these 2 different neighborhoods, including school quality and the cell phone tower, by sort of putting a fixed effect that soaks up anything that's common with these things, right, to the houses that are in this sort of blue circle, right? That's my fixed effect strategy. Okay. But if I really care about measuring the value of being up on that hill elevation, right, my 2 houses in that blue, right, that soaks up their high elevation, right, and this soaks up that these guys are low elevation. So when I then compare these houses, right, I've removed elevation from the equation. It's gone. This blue circle captures elevation and my cell phone tower. So this is where the standard literature has run into this problem. What we're going to do is we're going to extend a model that was developed in labor economics to think about people controlling for the same person over time and their wage rates. We're going to think about this in a spatial context. Right? So what I really want to do is I want to estimate differences between houses, green landscaping or not, next to the cell phone tower or not, within these blue circles. But then I really want to line up these blue circles and I want to run a regression with those on the left-hand side. I really want to say, well, why is that blue circle capturing more price value than this blue circle? Well, oh, it's because it's higher elevation. But I want to do that in a statistically valid way. So that's going to be, but this is where the literature currently is, and we don't think often enough about these spatial scale problems, right? So we're going to solve this problem. Okay. So fixed effect estimation, that's my blue circles, fixed effect estimation, makes strong assumptions on the scale of capitalization relative to the scale of variation in the correlated omitted variables. So I don't doubt that the fixed effects soaked up omitted variables, such as the cell phone tower, but it made a strong assumption about where elevation is getting identified. It has to be identified within the blue circle now, differences from the houses within it, not between them. So if the spatial fixed effects are too big, right, because I don't want to worry about soaking up my elevation difference, well, now I still have omitted variables. Right, I haven't done a very good job of controlling for omitted variables because I made my spatial fixed effects too big. In the extreme, I just don't have any spatial fixed effects. Or I just have a constant in my regression, right? That's no spatial fixed effects. If instead spatial fixed effects are essentially too small, right? They subsume the maximum extent of capitalization, I'm only going to get at best a partial effect of the thing I want because the fixed effects soaked some of it up, and I might not get any effect at all. Right, in my elevation picture here, right, I would have soaked up the entire value of elevation. It would have just been gone. Climate's even harder because, as we said, temperature varies over sort of coarse spatial scales, whereas inputs to temperature, like landscaping, vary over very local scales. So a one-size-fits-all approach to this is difficult. So I'm going to have to really confront these different spatial scales. So to get away from the economics for a minute and give a couple pictures, right? So this is Phoenix from up high, right there. We see some of the sprawl areas. The most interesting thing to me in that is that we've created man-made lakes. The ones that are long and straight, like the one on the top right, that is probably a water ski lake. So you can put your boat there and go water skiing after work. The one that's just kind of craggy, that's probably just for an aesthetic amenity of having a lake. Maybe you can go fishing. But that other one is a water ski, and you can probably go in 2 different directions. Okay, so we've changed this very dry-looking landscape. When you get to a slightly lower elevation and you fly into Phoenix, you actually realize there's a lot of green. Right? So for when you zoom out and you look at satellite imagery, it just looks like desert. You get in and you actually start seeing neighborhoods that have lots of trees, have lots of green landscaping. That is not natural. Right? If you go outside of Phoenix, you don't find those big trees growing unless you're right on a river that probably is flowing underground because we've drained enough of the water. It doesn't flow above ground anymore. Right? So you start getting these very green areas. Okay? So this is sort of the big picture view. Right? So green landscaping, right? This is one of the inputs into temperature, but it's also something people like independently of temperature. Right? It's a big water user. Right? So the water managers, the city of Phoenix especially, is concerned about this. About 75% of water use in Phoenix is for outdoors, so between pools and trees. Right? So when we start thinking maybe from a sustainability perspective about water use, green landscaping is a big input into this, in addition to pools. Okay? But it provides lots of benefits, and people are willing to pay the relatively low cost of water in order to get these benefits. Okay? So transforming these natural landscapes, right, to concrete, right, building houses or maybe not having trees, right, and you actually don't get the shade benefits, right, so the sun shines on the concrete instead of being shaded, right, it's going to really increase heat retention, right? And the urban heat island effect is being in this urban area with all this concrete, all this absorbing material, this raises temperatures at night, right? It wouldn't be too bad. Maybe in Boston this could actually be a good thing. You might actually want heat island because it would lower winter cooling bills. In Phoenix, this is probably a bad thing. Okay? In the middle of summer, when low temperatures start to only drop down to 80 degrees, people run the air conditioners all night long. Right? So not only is it uncomfortable, but we're starting to get electric usage as well. Because the temperatures, instead of dropping to 74, where maybe your AC clicks on and off, and if it only drops to 80, right now your AC just runs 24 hours a day. Right? So we start to see other causes. So also for some policymakers thinking about maybe more of the sustainability side of water, right, we start to worry about this green landscaping evaluation as well. Okay. This is urban heat island, really in its core. These are degrees Fahrenheit, thinking about summer low temperatures. And so we see that in the downtown, the red area of Phoenix, right, summer low temperatures are 79 to 83 degrees. That's the low nighttime temperature in summer. Okay, so that would be the month of July. Right? If you start getting farther away from the concrete jungle, right, it starts to cool down, and you can get 6, 7, 8, 9 degree difference depending on where you're located in the metro area, right, when you get farther out. The red square you see over here, that's an Air Force base. This thing over here, right, that's another Air Force base, right? So you put a lot of concrete down to the land plains, right, and it gets hotter. But largely we see this, and it's really concentrated in downtown, but we do see variation across lots of different space, right? But you notice I'm not zoomed in all the way to a house. Right, I'm not going to reliably be able to tell you what the difference in, a tenth of a degree is. Just like your question earlier, nobody knows the difference in a tenth of a degree, but they do notice 6 degrees. Right, that might be more noticeable. If I start to think about green landscaping, so on the right, these are individual homes. This is taking some remote sensing data with reflectivity, trying to figure out what these people have done to their yards. Right, and the little green dots that are interspersed here in the red dots, these are guys that have green yards. The red dots are guys that essentially have rock or just dirt, so desert yards. If I then aggregate that up a little bit, the green splotches here are subdivisions where 75% or more of the homes in the subdivision are green. Right, so thinking about this different spatial scale, I like to have a green yard myself, but I might like it even more if all my neighbors have green yards because I really like green. Okay. So we see both partial and neighborhood flows are likely. And these are all going to be correlated with lots of spatial unobservables, right? So there's lots of things, golf courses, things like that, that are going to be mixed up in some of these green neighborhoods that I've got to worry about trying to control for the fact that that's next to a golf course. Okay. Yes?
Are the xeriscapes cooler than the greenscapes?
Greenscapes are cooler because of evaporational cooling. The xeriscapes are cooler than dirt if they put rock in, depending on the type of rock. And then in the downtown Phoenix areas where you don't have yards, it's pretty much just all concrete. That's the hottest. Yeah. So xeriscapes may be good for storm runoff, right, during monsoon season. Xeriscapes are probably good if you're worried about water use. Xeriscapes are not as desirable if you're worried about heat and being able to actually recreate on your own private property. So there's trade-offs people are willing to make. And I'm going to tell you how much that's worth, how much people on average are willing to pay for some of these trade-offs. So back to the economics and this idea about dealing with these spatial scales and dealing with unobservables at different levels of the spatial scale. So I'm going to think about a panel, right? So I said this model originally started in labor economics and we were thinking about wages of people, and I see the same person over time. I see grad students who get jobs and their income goes up, and by controlling for idiosyncrasies about that person, I can say, well, how much was education worth? Controlling for differences in ability or something like that. Right? Here, my panel is going to be a spatial panel. I'm going to think about census block groups as a spatial panel. This is robust to census tracts. Census block groups are 300 to 500 homes. Census tracts are roughly a 10x multiple of that. So we're thinking 3,000-ish homes. Right? It's going to be results of the same regardless of which I do. But I'm going to think about this. So I'm going to try to capture a block group and time period as a panel. So every time I see a house sell in the same block group and in the same year, that's an observation in my panel. If I see another house sell in that same block group and that same year, that's a second observation in that panel. Right? So, but I'm going to be able to control for observables that vary across time. So in Phoenix, we might think of new development that varies across time, right? And I'm going to be able to control for observables that vary across space, from one block group in a good school district to a block group in a bad school district, right? So this panel dimension, being a spatial and temporal panel, is going to capture both of these types of effects. It's also going to capture that your block group is next to a golf course or not, right? It's going to capture some, or next to the highway, right? It's going to capture a lot of these unobservables. They did a bunch of new highway construction in Phoenix as well during the early 2000s, and so these will, the time dimension of having a time dimension will soak up that highway construction effect. So what I'm going to do is I want to take the fixed effect idea, this thing called within variation, within my blue circle, and I want to look at differences within that blue circle and tease out the value of the things that vary right there. Then I want to take my blue circles, right, and I want to figure out these coarse variables like temperature that vary across my blue circles, or elevation across my blue circles, and I want to try to pick those up, right? But they're endogenous, right? They're correlated with unobservables, which is going to cause me to get the wrong estimate. So I need to find a way to then still instrument for that. And so this house, by exploiting these different spatial scales, I'm going to be able to get an instrument for free. Normally you say, well, what's correlated with temperature that's uncorrelated with anything else happening? It's kind of hard to tell that story in an urban area, right? I don't know, right? But I'm going to be able to use this different spatial scales to get a free instrument. And I'll show what that looks like, or how that works. And that's the insight of Hausman and Taylor in the early 80s in the labor economics world, thinking about a dimension of time, not thinking about a dimension of space. Okay? So Josh Abbott, one of my co-authors on this paper as well, and I have a paper where we thought about this in terms of space and adapted the model to this context. This one takes a step further and puts time back into the model as well. So I said I was going to take housing prices. I see lots of housing prices. A price of house I in block group J occurring in time t, and I'm going to run a regression. Right? Control for all the different attributes I can possibly control for. I'm going to use a convenient x as things that vary within panel, vary house to house within my blue circle. Right? Z are going to be things that are constant, like elevation in my blue circle story, things that are constant within the blue circle, but only vary across blue circles. So I have x's that vary within blue circle, and I have z's that vary across blue circle. In both of these, right, there's going to be things that are correlated with unobservables and probably things that are just not correlated with unobservables, right, for various reasons. Things that are exogenously given, maybe due to policy or something else. So within blue circle, I can think about subdivision measures of green landscaping. Right? Remember I have a block group. Block group is 300 to 500 homes. Average subdivision is 30 homes, plus or minus, right? So I've got 3 or 4 different subdivisions in a block group. So I can see one is green, one is not. Right, so within my block group blue circle, I've got some green subdivisions and some not green subdivisions. Right, so I can pick that up. I can also think about things like square footage, whether or not your house has a pool, things that vary house to house within that blue circle. Many of these are going to be confounded by omitted variables, but some might not be. And I'll give an argument for why that might be, and it's going to largely have to do with idiosyncrasies caused by adjacency problems and zoning problems, things like that. When I think about differences across blue circles, so this big spatial scale from one block group time period to another block group time period, right? A lot of this stuff is also going to be correlated with unobservables, school quality, fire protection, access to your employment centers, things like that, right? And so I've got, the thing I really care about is temperature, right? So I need an instrument. I need something correlated with temperature that's uncorrelated with price in order to remove this confounding by this stuff being correlated. And I'm going to get that for free. This is my panel fixed effect or panel random effect in this model. Right, so that's my fixed effect. That's my blue circle. Normally you wouldn't get anything in Z. So this is the normal approach. This is the fixed effect approach I said that people typically do. So you would take price, you would put a fixed effect for each block group and time period in the model, and that soaks up everything in Z. It's gone. I'm done. Like that's where I identify the effect of green landscaping, and I don't have any ability now to identify the effect of temperature at all. It's missing. It's soaked up by that fixed effect. Naively, without worrying about the statistics of how this works, what I really want to do is I want to run that top regression second. I want to then decompose this thing in some meaningful way. I could use random effects, so you say, why don't you just use random effects? Well, random effects, unless my unobservables are essentially independent of the variables in my model, I'm going to get biased, right? So that's not ideal, right? So random effects, yes, it can do this, but it's going to give me biased estimates, which means they're not right. So I might not want to make policy off of those. Okay? And so this is where the Hausman-Taylor is going to come into the model, is going to let us solve this problem. So how does this work? Right. So I've got JT panels, so block group and time period. Right. Each unique combination of those is a panel. I'm going to do exactly what I just said I was going to do. I'm going to use some fixed effects estimator to get everything that varies within those block groups and time periods identified. That's the standard fixed effects story to soak up on observables, right? And it's going to give me an estimate of this fixed effect for each block group and time period. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to use the residuals from this regression to try to do a transformation of my data. Okay, this is the Houseman-Taylor approach. I'm not going to get into the weeds here, I promise, but I'm going to take these residuals and I'm going to be able to transform my data and run a GLS regression. So I'm going to put some squigglies on stuff to add an intercept, right? I'm going to transform everything. The insight here is, okay, this looks so far okay, whatever. The insight is I still need an instrument. And Houseman and Taylor realized that I can use variation in the panel mean, so within a block group and time period, I can take the mean of things that are exogenous and use those as instruments, right? So if I take the mean of everything within a blue circle, that's at the blue circle level, right? So the scale matches up, and I can use that mean of that variable as an instrument if it's exogenous. So I'm going to get a free instrument out of my model if this localized thing is exogenous. That was their insight, to get a free instrument. So what are these instruments going to look like? Okay, so I need something that varies house to house, that people care about, that when I average that across all my houses is correlated with temperature and is exogenous. So one thing that might help me here is elevation. Elevation's God-given. People don't make elevation, at least not in any meaningful scale, right? And so if I took the average elevation of everybody in a block group, that's pretty exogenous. People aren't, building mountains to put houses on, right? That's pretty exogenous, and as we get higher elevation, temperatures drop, so it's correlated with temperature, right? So maybe I could use the average elevation as an instrument for differences in temperature across space and time. Okay, that doesn't vary across time, it only varies across space, so it's probably a weak instrument, so maybe I need some more instruments. So another thing that we've thought about with the heat island temperature effect is density, right? That's been the whole story all along. Well, it just so happens that there are zoning regulations for peak monsoon rains, and people don't have gutters in Phoenix, so all the water just sort of pours off your house, and you have to set aside for new development these sort of drainage swale areas to absorb this water to prevent essentially flooding, right? And so if you've got a lot of these because you're maybe in a more recent development, right? Maybe your individual houses are next to them or not next to them, but on average, if you're really close to these as a subdivision, you're less dense because you have a lot of these undeveloped areas that are for stormwater retention. Okay, we see this in a lot of Delaware County. We see the same idea. You'll see the new subdivisions with sort of the green depressed area in between rows of houses and the street goes on each side, right? Same idea, just in Phoenix we do this as well, but only for monsoon season. So it could be something like your average distance to one of these. That tells me how many of these there are, which kind of gets at an idea of how dense my area might be. And if density really matters for temperature, right, maybe that thing's a good instrument. Right? So I need to test these things to make sure they're exogenous, right? But this is the idea behind trying to come up with instruments. Another thing might be adjacency. So if I'm right next to one of these drainage swales, the more people in my neighborhood, the average adjacency. So if I'm next to it and you're not, the average adjacency is 50%. The more people that are adjacent to one of these, the less dense the area is going to be, right? Because we have a lot of natural landscaping in between us. It's not just concrete. Okay. So several ideas playing on density and playing on elevation to get instruments. So how do I run this big regression? So I take 500,000 transactions, then I can change the time periods here. I was trying to get rid of some of the boom and bust stuff that happened after 2004. It's robust to that. Take a lot of transactions spread across the whole 40 by 40 mile area, right? Those are all little black dots that run together. I've got about 1,600 block groups, right? Take all my block group times year combinations, right? And give me about 10,000 panels, right? So I've got 10,000 JT combinations. That's my panel dimension, right? Get rid of some housing price inflation, and I'm also going to do that with fixed effects. Block groups, there's what they look like, right? So in downtown Phoenix, they're really small. When you get farther out, they get bigger, because these are defined as a function of how many people live there, right? So they try to get the same number of people, more or less, in each one of these block groups when the census makes these things. That just reflects the area, right? So I said I'm going to have to make some things exogenous that vary locally, vary from house to house. Right? I'm going to use the average of these exogenous things that vary from house to house as an instrument. Okay? Three things I'm going to use here, and I'll show a test for whether or not these things are exogenous in a minute. Three things I'm going to use. Adjacency to the subdivision open space. Subdivision open space is sort of this developer set-aside area, largely for stormwater retention. It does not typically have playgrounds on it. Right? That would be a local park. Okay? So this is just an undeveloped area in the subdivision, a strip that they've left undeveloped, okay? Separating houses or something. 5% of my homes, on average, are adjacent to some of this. So this is pretty widespread, and it's widespread because of a policy regulation about retaining water. Okay? So every subdivision has these. Another version of this, same type of variable, is how far your house is from subdivision open space. Right? So people are pretty close, less than a third of a mile from this, because it's pretty much in all the subdivisions. Okay? Some of the older subdivisions in downtown Phoenix are going to be farther away because each subdivision back then didn't have this regulation. And then elevation, so in hundreds of meters, hundreds of meters. So we're looking at it somewhere around 1,200 feet elevation. Okay. Temperature, right, at the block group level, 78 degrees is the average low temperature, ranges from 73 to 83, depending on where you are in landscape, so a 10-degree difference, thinking about could people perceive this difference across space. 10 degrees, even when you watch the local news and they show the low temperatures, Phoenix is big enough, they show it in lots of different places, and you can see these differences. So if anybody's local, they would certainly see that. Other things I care about, 9% of the houses have green landscaping, and about 9% as well are also houses are in a green subdivision. Okay? They don't line up 1-to-1, right? Every green house isn't in a green subdivision, but it's about 9% of the area, 1 out of 10. And lots of other things. So the idea is that I'm going to use the means, the averages of these, as instruments for this. Right? That's the Houseman-Taylor insight. Need at least as many of these instruments as endogenous coarse variables. Check, I've got 3 potential instruments here, so even if individually they're not as strong as I'd like them to be overall, they're probably a decent instrument. We'll look at that. Right? Exogeneity of instruments in the Houseman-Taylor literature is asserted. I'm actually going to develop a walled test so I can actually test for this and see whether or not they really are exogenous or not. In the existing literature, people just said, yes, this is my story, this is why it's exogenous, and moved on. And then I'm going to do some comparison, and it's in the paper. I won't get into a lot of that. And I'm going to cluster in standard errors for heteroscedasticity by the table dimension. Okay? So here are my instruments. So I can think about a Houseman test for exogeneity. So are individually are these things exogenous? Yes, they are. Okay. So I can run a test. Yes, the p-values are bigger than 0.1 or 0.05, whatever your cutoff is. These things are exogenous. Jointly, yes, they're exogenous. Are they correlated with temperature? So the average adjacency to subdivision open space, right? The more adjacency you have, the more of this you have, the lower the temperatures are. So that's good, right? The farther you are from this, the hotter temperatures are. Right? So that's good. That's my story. And the higher up you are, the lower temperatures are. Okay? So I've got fairly good correlation, and I'm exogenous. Yeah.
Why do you use the first measure rather than more typical per square kilometer measure?
People per square kilometer for
density.
For density. So this is the people per square kilometer doesn't tell me about the physical landscape that retains heat, right? So if, say I had an apartment building, or say I had 20 people living in my house, right? It doesn't tell me about the physical structure of heat. But yeah, it's a good question. Okay. So these things are correlated, they're exogenous. So I've got an instrument, so now I can stack my little blue circles up and I can run this regression and I can instrument for temperature. So what do I find? So this is a semi-log regression, so all of these things we're going to interpret as percent of house price. Okay. So what we're going to find is that if I increase your nighttime low temperatures by 1 degree, your house price is going to go down by 3.6%. So if we think about Phoenix and we think about an average house price of, let's say $1,500 a month as a rent, right, as a rental price, 3% of your $1,500 a month, we're looking around $50 a month. That's not too crazy when you think about running your AC 24 hours a day versus having it turn off at night and opening the windows. Right? We're actually not too far off with just what some of the actual electric costs could be, but they're showing up, and people aren't buying houses looking at electric bills across space, right? People are saying, it's comfortable, it's not comfortable, how much am I willing to pay here? But from a believability standpoint, this isn't too crazy. Think about green landscaping. right? So if I have a green yard, it's about 1% bump to my house price. If I have a pool, for comparison, it's almost 5% bump to my house price, right? People like pools, right? But if I live in a green subdivision, I get an 8% bump, right? So to buy into this exclusive subdivision where everybody's house is green and I'm getting benefits from their greenness and my greenness, right? Independent of temperature, right? I'm getting a much bigger bump. So let's turn these into some dollar numbers and see what these things look like. So using the mean price, I think it was $13.98 Case-Shiller adjusted, right? 1 degree reduction in temperature is about $50 per month. Okay. That's the difference attributed to temperature. From talking to some of the engineers out there, electric bills are somewhere in the $30 to $50 range, depending on whether or not you turn your AC off at night or not, right? Depending on these 10-degree differences in temperature across space. So it's not too crazy of a number. In a hypothetical study, hypothetical, I go and I ask somebody, how much would you pay to go from 105 to 100, right? Somebody said the average was 38 bucks, right? Not a study I've done, but somebody else did that. So we're not too far off using this for real preference data from other numbers that are out there. They're not ridiculously high. Green landscaping, right, about $17 a month. So when you look at houses and you've got 2 houses for rent right next to each other, one has green landscaping and one doesn't, the one with green landscaping, 17 bucks a month more. If that identical house is instead located in a green subdivision, you get a big premium, about $115 premium from this green landscaping. So these are the dollar numbers that I started out the talk and I said, I would like to put these things into a policy world and I need to know the trade-offs. So if your policy is to save water and eliminate green landscaping, right? Well, these are the costs that people with that would incur if you did that. If instead you said, well, maybe I want to think about water policy and I want to just change the marginal price of water to sort of stamp out this green landscaping stuff. I think it's a bad use of water. Well, the question is, can you do this with a marginal change? And the answer is probably not. The average Phoenix water bill is pretty cheap. It's about $40. Making a couple pennies difference in the water price, you're not going to get to $17. You're certainly not going to get to $100 a month. Right? So marginal changes in the price of water are unlikely to make big differences in green landscaping. Okay? But we started to put some economic numbers on this. Okay? So if you're worried about it, this is the first step, and this is how economics can then be integrated into thinking about evaluating and designing policies. Maybe a more effective water policy, instead of changes in the incremental price of water, is to have a surcharge. Drive around, have somebody survey people's houses. If you have a green yard, you get a $20 bill. $20 a month tack onto your bill, right? We do that for lots of other things, right? We could certainly do this for green landscaping. Okay? We do this for different size electric hookups, different size water pipes, right? We could also do this with pools, right? So there'd be lots of ways we could do this, but a marginal change, arguing about whether or not we should increase the price of water by 5% or not, and that's going to help with the green landscaping, probably not going to do much because people value that quite highly. Okay? The other insight here is we need to think about a way that we can link heat that varies over broad spatial scales with something that varies very locally, like landscape. We need to do this together so we don't confound the value of heat with the value of landscape. Right? So this new method has done that, right? And we sort of try to push this to thinking about space as a temporal and time dimension, as a temporal and spatial dimension. Questions?